Hello, AP Psychos. Question for you. What makes you happy? And what is correlated with happiness? And I don't mean like short term happiness, I mean like lifelong, sustained well being. And that's probably maybe the most important lesson you could take away from this class. I mean, because doesn't everybody want to be happy? Isn't that the ultimate goal in life, really, when it comes down to it? Maybe for sane people. So today we get into something about emotions like happiness, as well as the psychology, the science behind what makes people happy and what's correlated with happiness. Positive psychology is kind of a subfield, a newer version of maybe humanist psychology, kind of a branch off of it. It's the scientific research on human flourishing and well-being. Because, a lot of psychology is more focused on the negative stuff like anxiety and mental illness, and why not study the positive side of things? So whereas humanist psychology, yeah, it's focused on that too. Humanist psychology was more of a counseling type of psychology, whereas this is more science. So what is the science behind being happy is one of the things we'll look at here, as well as the other emotions. So let's get to it. So, first of all, let's start with happiness. And what does not make you happy, or does it? Money? Not necessarily. In fact, the research shows that, yeah, if you're below the poverty line and you have basic needs that aren't being met, shelter and food and such, you can't pay your bills, that you're living on the street, yeah. So money could improve happiness in those situations. Once people are above the poverty line and they have the basic needs met, that's when it drops out and it gets all, not necessarily correlated with happiness. The happiest people on earth, they do this, there's a lot of research in recent decades on this, are Nordic regions, cultures like the Finnish and Danes. Those people just generally score higher in happiness. Yeah, they're wealthier nations, so they have basic needs met, but they're actually happier than Americans, which is the wealthiest nation, because there's other things about more than just money that is going on in those cultures. In any case, youth, not so much. It's not like generally people have a sustained sense of how happy they are across the lifespan generally. Attractiveness, not at all. Self-focus, not really. In fact, the more self-focused and trying to make yourself happy you are, the less you get it. It's kind of ironic. Leisure time, downtime, like wouldn't you just like to chill and veg? Not so much. They find that the happier people are those who are engaged in something that's challenging them. Not overwhelming, but perfect match for their skill set. Genetics, maybe. They do find that there might be some genetic predisposition for a certain range of happiness for people, which is not to say you have no control. It's not fate to be happy or unhappy, but there's something called a set point for happiness, kind of like a general range of happiness. If you win the lottery, there's a lot of research on this. If you win several $1 million in the lottery, yeah, you'll be happy for about a little while, 6 months or so. After a while, though, you return after the high of winning all that and buying all this stuff. People generally return to their general range of happiness. And it seems that genetics may have a little to do with dictating the range of what that set point is. So anyway, let's look at what does make you happy. And so I'll use this. It actually works out that I'm able to make this fit into an acronym, HAPPY. So the research behind happiness and what makes people have a greater sense of well-being, or SWB, subjective well-being, across the lifespan, starts with H, for health. Number one, if healthier people, they're happier. I mean, after all, they're not suffering. That's obvious. But also healthy habits, healthy diet and exercise is correlated with happier people, and healthy sleep habits and sleep discipline and such. Health is very important to happiness, of course, and healthy lifestyles. A for attitude. Having a positive, optimistic attitude is correlated with happiness. Do you remember the confirmation bias? We notice we notice things that support our views. People who are optimistic will notice when things are going right. People who are pessimists will also engage in confirmation bias. They tend to notice when things are not going right. So there's that negative frame of mind. So attitude is very important. So a positive attitude, and practicing gratitude, having a thankful outlook on things and appreciating things you have, and practicing that habit of mind is an important contributor to happiness, they've found. What you're looking at here is an experiment they did where fake it till you make it kind of stuff. They had people look at cartoons, and some of the subjects, they had them bite on I don't have a pen on me, bite on the pen initially, like so, where it forced them into a smiling muscle position, and others held it in their lips, like this one here, and it forced the frowning muscles. And they had them evaluate on a scale of 1 to 10, one of those Likert scales, how funny they thought the cartoons were. And on average, those who held the pen like so, where they're forced into a fake smile, actually rated the cartoons funnier than those who had a fake frown. So sometimes there's something about this fake it till you make it. So if you're not having a good day, fake it. Act happy, and it might trick your brain and sort of cause the release of dopamine and such, so that you maybe start being happier. There is something. Our attitudes follow our behaviors rather than the other way around. Sometimes we think that we have an attitude and we behave accordingly of how we think, but it turns out that if you slump over and you have this sort of kind of Eeyore kind of depressing posture, it affects your attitude rather than the other way around. So fake it till you make it. HAP for people. Perhaps the strongest correlate with lifelong happiness was social network, social support. They didn't find any relation whatsoever with people with more friends being happier, but deeper friendships. So it doesn't mean more friends, a bigger network of friends necessarily, but the strength of the connection. So at least one good friend, deep relationship. Social support is essential for happiness. We need people we can turn to, and social isolation is devastating. There's a reason why prisons are not allowed to put people in solitary confinement for very long. We go crazy. We need other people, and it's a major correlate with happiness and health. Even your physical health is affected by all of this. Another P, HAP, P for purpose. The research shows that having a higher transcendent sense of purpose is important for happiness. You'll notice something that's kind of sad. They poll incoming freshmen each year in college across the decades about what their highest goals are. And it used to be to develop a meaningful life philosophy in life. But it's been around the 70s and 80s, it changed to where, it's materialism. People want to get rich. That turns out is counteractive with not necessarily correlate with happiness. Having this higher transcendent purpose, and it could be religion, but not necessarily, something transcendent. If you remember Maslow's hierarchy, self-actualization was the top, but in his final years, Maslow revised that. He believed that an even higher sense of purpose is purpose, a higher sense of meaning. He called it self-transcendence. Thinking beyond yourself to some higher goal is correlated with happiness. And finally, Y, HAPPY, yin yang. And by this, we mean balance. And so the research shows that if people find an activity that they do daily, like maybe it's your career related, hopefully, that is perfectly matched to your skill set. So it's challenging, it engages you. You lose yourself in your work. You forget what time it is. You maybe even forget to eat. You're so consumed by the activity of what you're doing because it's so intrinsically motivating. It's not about the paycheck. So finding a job that's perfectly matched to your skill set, where you enter what's called a state of flow, FLOW they call it. The flow state is where you lose yourself in your work, and it's extremely rewarding. It's very intrinsic activities, so finding that yin-yang kind of balance. Not work that's overwhelmingly stressful, not work that's overly easy either. Again, leisure, we don't like just laying around for very long. So finding that engaging activity. So maybe it's hobby-related, or more importantly, maybe it is career-related activities. That you could find to engage that sense of flow, engaging some intrinsic motive. All right, so moving on to the next topic here. Emotions of other kinds. Are they nature or nurture? Would you find these around the world universal in all cultures, these facial expressions? Or are they culturally specific and are they nurtured that way and in other places around the earth? Well, to answer this question, a guy named Paul Ekman went around the world into different cultures and did in fact show people of all different cultures these faces to see if they could identify it in their own language. And it turns out that it was more than just these 6, but these are the 6 they narrowed it down to. And you could probably name these emotions if you saw them too. So no matter where you are, and it seems to be that there are at least these 6 natural universal facial expressions. Again, his name is Ekman. He's probably well known for that, but also he inspired Don't Lie to Me, the TV series, where he tried to identify liars in little expressions called micro expressions. So he's kind of famous for that too. But in any case, he did find that there's at least these 6, and maybe there could be 7 or 8 universal natural facial expressions of these emotions here. Beyond these, there's like disdain and scoffing. There's certain other kinds of emotions that might not be universal. You wouldn't find in other places. Movie Inside Out, great for demonstrating some of what we're talking about here. All right, this is Cujo. All right, Cujo comes barking at you, and the question now, this is to get into several theories of emotions. So we're about to talk about several major theories of how we experience emotions. The big question historically throughout the 20th century between psychologists is what comes first? Here's the stimulus, which is Cujo here, scaring you. Obviously, emotional fear is going to be what we're looking at here. Do you experience, the emotion of fear and then start to tremble and have the sympathetic autonomic nervous system response where you go into fight or flight? If you remember that term, sympathetic nervous system. So your heart starts to race and your adrenaline and cortisol kick in and you start to tremble. Or is there the stimulus? Then you start to tremble and go into the sympathetic response, and you're breathing fast. Then you're like, well, I must be afraid of this dog. Then the conscious emotion. So which comes first is the question here that they grappled with: the conscious emotion of fear, then the autonomic sympathetic nervous system response, or the trembling autonomic response, then the conscious emotion of fear. Which comes first? Well, the first to weigh in on this was the James Lang theory. Now, James Lange or Lang. And by the way, this to let you know how old this is William James. If you remember way back in the first unit, William James is back in the 1800s. He helped Americanize psychology, helps to establish the APA and the first Department of Psychology at Harvard. In any case, James Lang theory, they believed it happened in this order. So first comes a stimulus, Cujo, the dog, barking at you. Then the physical, autonomic response of the sympathetic nervous system response, fight or flight. Then you're like, oh, I must be afraid of that dog. You have the conscious emotion of fear. So in that order. And the facial feedback with the cartoons and the biting on the pen and finding it more humorous if you were forced into a smile, basically the body happens first, in this case the smile, then you experience humor, more likely when looking at the cartoons than if you were forced into a frown. So the bodily response seems to dictate the emotion in this case. It's kind of like the cart leading the horse a little bit. It seems a little backwards. But they do find some evidence of that, and the facial feedback of what we were talking about with the cartoons and the pen might support that somewhat, that the body happens first, then the conscious feeling of fear. So something scares you and you jump, and they're like, oh, I must be afraid because I just jumped in response to that thing scaring me. But an updated one was by Cannon and Bard theory. By the way, the guy that coined the term fight or flight, I think, was this dude here, Cannon. I believe they were brain scientists. In any case, that doesn't matter. Cannon Bard theory basically says this, that they occur not one before the other, but simultaneously, and that's your key word there, is they seem to occur simultaneously. With brain scans, they found that they could scare people or have certain stimuli and see how the brain responded, and it seems that it occurs at the same time. Your brain can multitask. So it seems like, you see Cujo, the stimulus, and a certain part of your brain tells simultaneously tells the higher region of the brain to experience fear at the same time as it tells parts of the brainstem and deeper down in the limbic system to have the physiological trembling response and the adrenaline rush at the same time. And that part of the brain, and here's a quiz question, a little review. What part of the brain was it that is your relay station in the brain? It's your router. Incoming stimuli gets routed to other regions of the brain through the center in the brain, the thalamus, not to be confused with the hypothalamus. So here's Cujo, and you're receiving the stimuli, and you hear him barking or whatever, and your thalamus relays the information to the cerebral cortex to have the feeling of the conscious emotion of fear at the same time as the thalamus signals your hypothalamus and the limbic system area to have the physiological response, at the same time. So it seems like there's some brain research to support that. But what are we overlooking here? There's a second factor, of this happening before that or whatever. Yeah, but what are we missing here? A second factor that wasn't considered in this long kind of debate is that maybe how you think of the dog. How do you appraise the dog? What do you think of Cujo? Which brings in a whole nother level of thinking. Like you might actually see him as cute and fun. And maybe the reason your heart is racing is not because you're afraid of Cujo. It may be because you feel a sense of thrill. You enjoy wrestling with Cujo in the yard. He's your neighbor's dog, and you're like, oh, Cujo, come here. And you're rolling around. He's slobbering all over your face. And you like that sort of thing for some reason. So the second factor to consider here that wasn't considered before is how you appraise the stimulus or think about the situation, which one person may label it fear, another person may label it fun. And that changes everything, even though your heart is racing in either case. So that's called the two-factor theory. And this is a synonym alert. It's also sometimes called the Schachter-Singer theory because of the guys that came up with it. And this is important to note here too. This is cognitive psychology. Remember what that means? How we think. So how you think or cognitively interpret the dog. In either interpretation, your physiological response is the same. Your heart is racing, but one, you've got a big smile on your face and you're wrestling with Cujo, and the other one, you're running for your life. But your heart is racing in either case. So the second factor to consider that's important here, the reason it's called the two-factor theory, is how you interpret the situation. Now, this leads to some interesting stuff I'd like to talk about here. One is they did this experiment in the Schachter and Singer where they injected people with a dose of basically adrenaline. They're going to cause their heart to race, but they lied to them and told them it was something else. While they send the person into the waiting room, in one situation, they're waiting with another person who is pretending to be another subject in the experiment, but they're actually actors. And in one, he's cracking jokes. I guess he has a hula hoop. But anyway, he's having a lot of fun. He's like, isn't this exciting? We're going to be in an experiment. I wonder what this is all about. Whereas in the other situation, some subjects are waiting with this guy who's becoming angry because he has to wait for 20 or 30 minutes and he has places to be and he starts pacing and pounding on the door and he's getting ticked off that he has to wait and storms out and such. And then they ask you to come into the next room, and according to the situation you were in, as your heart starts to race, because this stuff's kicking in, and you're like, wait, why am I breathing fast? Oh, it must be because I'm excited about this experiment. Or your heart starts to race as this, whatever it is, kicks in, and you interpret it as like anger. So the way in the post-interview, the way they answered that, how you felt about the waiting room situation, is dictated by the situation. Another way that the Schachter-Singer two-factor, consideration of, how you interpret the situation is in something like with roller coasters. If you're on a roller coaster, if you're beside somebody who fears the roller coasters, whereas you love roller coasters, both of you, your hearts are going to be racing. Your sympathetic nervous system is, going into fight or flight, basically. But one of you got a big smile on your face, the other one's got a big frown, and you're, going to die. But the way you interpret it, fun or fear, is a matter of how you label and cognitively think about it. It's what they've also found is something called the spillover effect or excitation transfer. what causes your emotional response in one situation may spill over or be transferred to another situation or stimulus. They did this one experiment where they had people walk across this high suspension bridge, men of a certain age, and it was kind of scary up on this high gorge, swinging in the air. And even if you're not scared of heights, it's going to cause a little heart race. And this young lady would approach them and ask them interview questions for something in the middle of the bridge before proceeding. In another situation, the young woman would approach men in the park, but not on the high suspension bridge, just on a low trail area where there's no fear of heights or anything involved. In a follow-up activity, they try to determine how attractive they found the woman to be. Turns out, those who were approached on the high suspension bridge tended to find her more attractive than the men she approached on the low trail. So in other words, their excitement, and they're not even realizing it, but they're kind of up there in the air swinging over the high gorge, and their heart's racing. They transferred that onto her, basically finding her more attractive. They did this also with people getting off like a workout, like getting off of the treadmill at a 24-hour fitness place versus people who are about to get on the treadmill, and those who are getting off, their heart's racing because they just worked out, tended to find the person more attractive in follow-up interviews. Ways of, they did it in a way that didn't seem suspicious, because I'd be like, did you find her attractive? Was she hot? They didn't ask it that way. But in any case, so this is excitation transfer, and it supports the two-factor theory, where the way you interpret the situation or misinterpret it, is important for how you label the emotion. Now, there's something else we need to consider. This is something called the Zaïmpl-Ledoux theory. It's the two-pathway theory. And I don't want you to get this mixed up with the two-factor theory. This is called the two-pathway theory because we're not talking about the second factor being how you think in this case. We're talking about two brain pathways. There's two different pathways through your brain for how you experience emotions. So one of those pathways is sometimes called the high road, and one of those pathways through your actual brain physically is the low road. And basically, low road emotions are things like disgust and fear. If you see a rattlesnake, you don't have to process that or think about it. You're like jumping, climbing a tree. So those are very fast sort of, we've had those longer, but those kind of responses way back in evolutionary past. Whereas high road emotions are more things like love and hatred and things that might require some processing, like, do I love her? I'm really not sure. I need to think about that. So it's something you process longer. So which pathway do you think activates faster? That would be, of course, the low road. Those are very instinctual, fast pathway, which is the lower kind of gut feelings and more limbic system kind of responses, as opposed to cerebral cortex thinking parts of the brain. Opponent process theory of emotion is another one. We've talked about opponent process in terms of color. If you recall, like when you stare at a green light, the after image will be red. But this is kind of similar. There's a bipolar process also with emotions. So the opponent process theory might be an example of like post-concert depression, if you've ever experienced that, which is like, you get excited about this big event or concert or whatever, you go to it, and after it's over, you don't just come back down to homeostasis. You're like, okay, life's back to normal. You actually have kind of an emotional hangover where you actually feel depressed after the concert. By the way, post-concert depression, that's nothing the AP psychology people would ever ask you on a test, but it gives you an example, in case you've experienced that, of how you experience a stimulus for a while and you're very excited, and after the stimulus is over and the event's over, you don't just go back to homeostasis. You actually, if you remember, the parasympathetic brings you down and maybe actually swing you in the opposite direction a little bit after the event's over. So you might experience the opposite mood for a while. So that's the opponent process theory. It might also account for bipolar disorder to some extent, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Finally, one last theory, and that's good old Darwin. So why do we have emotions like fear and love and so on? Well, according to evolutionary theory, they helped us adapt and survive. Having an emotional response to a saber-toothed tiger, is probably going to save your life. You don't go up there and try to pet the kitty. You should probably have fear and run away and survive another day to procreate and carry on the species. So emotions have an evolutionary function. So why do you get nervous and go into fight or flight mode when you're speaking in public? Well, that's just kind of a hangover from our evolutionary past. You shouldn't probably be afraid like you would be for a saber-toothed tiger in that case. But yeah, emotions serve an adaptive function that helped us survive, and typically that works. But sometimes it's just a nuisance when your palms get all sweaty and such. And so that is positive psychology's look at happiness and flourishing, as well as the psychology behind emotions and the debate over what comes first, your physiological bodily experience or conscious experience. So think about some of the things you could take away, especially the HAPPY. That's something to remember. See you guys later.